Today, we are organizing an event in an ACL along with Tadagam, along with the association with Acl Expresso. We are conducting our event in the second floor, and here we have our speaker, Mr. Peter Balakian, the Pulsar Prize-winning and a New York Times best-selling author. He has come here to give an excellent speech on translating memories across languages and cultures, a conversion with Peter Balakian. Our staff, Mr. Sil sir, will give an introduction about him.
Good morning, one and all. It's a great pleasure to introduce Mr. Peter Balakin here on behalf of Anna Central Library in this occasion of Acl Expresso program. Here, Peter Balakin is a celebrated American poet, author, and scholar renowned for his powerful and evocative writings on social justice, culture, and the human experience. Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Mr. Peter Balakian is the author of 9 books of poems and 4 books of prose and 3 collaborative translations and several edited books. Ozone Zonal won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. A Pulitzer Prize winner and New York Times bestselling author, Balakian's work has garnered international acclaim, solidifying his position as one of the most esteemed voices in contemporary literature. Thank you for all, one and all.
I've been asked to speak about my book, Black Dog of Fate, for about 20 minutes, and then my wonderful translator, Chitra, and I will do some readings of short passages. First, let me say some thank yous to you all at the library, staff, this beautiful place to be in, this archive of literature, of Tamil culture. I just got a glimpse of it. I'm very grateful to Amurdasan, Polraj, and the Tadagam Press for bringing my book out in several months. That's exciting to me to be in your great language, your great and ancient language, and to Chitra Bhaskaran for being my translator. That just to meet her here is terrific. My cousin Lynn Derderian is with me on this trip to India, and that's a great joy for me. My friend Vivek Narayanan, who's a terrific poet. If you don't know Vivek's poems, you should, is with me as well, at least for my Chennai moment, and Vivek is a native of Chennai. Thanks for welcoming me this way. And let me just say that getting an email from Chennai from Mr. Polraj about publishing my book in Tamil came out of the blue, as we say. So here I am. And I just got off a plane last night. I'm a little bit in time warp, but you'll bear with me. All right, so what can I say to you? The book, of course, will be out in Tamil in May. So I'm giving you a little bit of an introduction to this book. And I'd like to make the book in a compressed way, as accessible to your imaginations as I can in a short time. In some way, Black Dog of Fate is a memoir and a family story memoir about my own coming of age in a suburb of New York City in northern New Jersey, USA, in the 1950s and 60s, and then on. And it deals with the collision of cultures. Outside, the Balakians of Teaneck and Tenafly, New Jersey, were very mainstream Americans. Inside, we were Armenian, inside the house. So I want to play with the idea of collision of cultures. You tell me in our conversation afterward how here in Tamil Nadu you have collisions of cultures, outside world, inside world, two cultures coming together you live within them in complicated and even mysterious ways. So that's one theme we can talk about. The other theme in Black Dog of Fate deals with the transmission of trauma across generations. And the trauma in this story is the trauma of the genocide that happened to the Armenian people, known as the Armenian Genocide, at the hands of the Turkish government behind the screen of World War I in 1915. I'll talk a little bit more about that. This trauma was buried in my family, not spoken about openly. But yet, the history of that dark past leaked through. So I'm going to talk about that issue too. Trauma across generations that's transmitted, collision of cultures, all American inside Armenia. So let me say that we grew up in a very mainstream all-American world, if that means something to you, all-American world. My father was a physician, came home every day from his job, in his practice in the next town. This is very suburbia. If you have images of America suburbia, late 1950s, 1960s, maybe you have some of those images in TV land here, pop culture, movies, and so on. My mom, a very, I would say, all-American mom. She had a BA in chemistry from Bucknell University. She worked in the Ciba Geigy pharmacy lab after her college days. But when she married my dad in 1950, she was a stay-at-home mom, raising her 4 children, all devoted to us, right? And there are images in my memoir of mom in a 1957 Chevy. Does that ring a bell? 57 Chevy, a very American car of the post-war era, shuffling us from our sports events, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, birthday parties, social events, all of that. You know, we as kids, I'm the oldest of four, 2 sisters and a brother. We're very involved in American athletics. In fact, I was a serious player of football and baseball. I went off to university to play football. Thank God I only played 1 year in university, and then I quit for more serious things. But I want to give you a sense of the all-American sports world of USA culture then. Pop culture, rock and roll, pop music, very important, from Elvis Presley to Bob Dylan. This occupied a lot of our life. Teenage pranks. I got into trouble now and then. My mother now looks back at it and says, you got into mischief. But it was worse than mischief at the time. I won't. You can read about it in the book. So that was this kind of all-American suburban life, right? But when you came home to our house, a beautiful neo-colonial home in suburban New York City, northern New Jersey, meaning big green lawns, white picket fences, right? Very pretty, very suburban, pastoral, if you will, a bit. And you closed the door to our house. Then you got the sense that there was another culture going on, and that culture was Armenian. And I'll say more about Armenian things in a minute. But inside of our house, you know how every house is a set of symbols about who you are, about what your culture is. In our house, we didn't replicate our all-American neighbors who might have had white shag carpet on the floor. We had oriental rugs. And what was that mother of pearl crucifix, right, doing on the wall next to the dartboard in the TV room? Why was there a framed, illuminated manuscript next to a post-impressionist picture in the living room, right? So there are all these symbols of another culture in our house. And my friends would come in and they would often ask, what is that? Or What about the food in the house? My mother's still living at 97 and a half, and she's a great cook. She was a great chef. And several nights a week, there was always Armenian food being cooked. Some nights a week you had American, some nights a week you had Armenian. The Armenian food had this beautiful aromatic aromas floating around the house, and you knew something was going on. And remember, as you all well know here in South India, how much cuisine embodies culture and history. So there's that part of my childhood. I'm getting these messages that are coming through the cuisine and the dishes and the food. And then there's the language. So inside the house, the older generation spoke Armenian. Now, they didn't want to teach it to us. That's a sad story, much more to say about it. But I would hear, my brothers and sisters and I, we would hear that archipelago of sounds coming from that ancient Armenian language. And we would pick up words, of course, and phrases, but we weren't fluent. Anyway, so you have the language, you have the food, you have the art, you have the artifacts, you have the rugs, you have all of that going on. Collision of cultures. The baseball bat and the leg of lamb, if you will. Okay, you get what I mean. At a certain point in my life, and as a young writer and a young poet, I came to understand that I had grown up in a house with a secret. Every family has secrets, right? Secrecy is part of the human experience, and families have closets with skeletons hanging in them. It's a phrase. I don't know if you have that, that phrase. There's skeletons hanging in your closet. They're dark things in the past that nobody wants to talk about, right? In my family, the secret that no one wanted to talk about was the brutal massacre, deportation, and genocide against the Armenian people in Ottoman Turkey in 1915. And the survival stories of my grandparents and their generation. That was considered too dark to talk about with us, the children. You wanted to keep the dark past from the youth. And you may have a similar sense of that experience with historical trauma in the various cultures and histories you've all inherited. But at the same time, no matter how hard people try to repress the trauma of history, they can't. And so, even there in the sunlight of suburban New Jersey, an affluent white suburban New Jersey where we were a happy all-American family, the darkness of that past leaked through the grid, if you will, came out of the clouds. I came to also understand that I had grown up hearing and sometimes watching encoded messages of the past, from the past. Sometimes in fragments of statements the grown-ups were making, sometimes in my grandmother's folk tales and dreams, sometimes in tidbits of information that were overheard. So I almost felt like I was hearing or seeing or experiencing messages in a bottle. In the second half of my book, I'm a young man, I'm a young poet, and I'm beginning to decode those encoded messages of trauma. So that's part of what you will get into. Now, at a certain point, you will see in this book from the start that the most important character in the book is my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was the survivor of a death march in August of 1915. The Turkish government put most of the Armenians, more than 2 million Armenians, the largest Christian minority in Turkey at the time, put over 2 million Armenians on death marches, massacring the men first, and then often abducting and raping and kidnapping women and children, but still driving the forced marches into the Syrian desert in North Syria, right below the southern Turkish border. My grandmother, Nafina, Nafina, it was a bastardization of Athena. It's a longer story to tell. My grandmother was the only survivor in her family. She, her first husband, who did not make it all the way on the death march, and her two infant and toddler daughters, the youngest of which, Alice, was my cousin Lynn's mother. So those three made it. They survived and got to Aleppo, Syria, in the fall of 1915, where my grandmother, then living in the famine-ravaged refugee quarter of that city, began to support herself as a seamstress. She had grown up quite wealthy. They were silk merchants. They were east-west traders. Who knows if they didn't have some roots to the silk routes in Madras, Chennai, at an earlier period. It's very possible because, as you know, the Armenian merchants have a long history in Chennai. It's just very exciting for me to connect with you here today over. But my grandmother, who had come from a wealthy, privileged family, had seen everyone in her family massacred in the first week or so of August 1915. Her brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, parents, in-laws, all of it gone. So there she was, living in that refugee quarter of Aleppo. And what did she begin to do? She began to compile affidavits for a human rights lawsuit against the Turkish government. An extraordinary act of witness and ethical accountability, and pursuit of some modicum of justice. I was shown that document, which she filed in New Jersey in 1920 upon her arrival in the United States. I was shown that document by my Aunt Gladys, her oldest daughter and the oldest on the death march, 60 years later. And that document, my publisher has beautifully reproduced in a facsimile way in Black Dog of Fate. And I know it will appear similarly in Tamil in several months, and that's very, very exciting to me. So that document gets into my story. Now, the very last part of the book is a bit like unpeeling an onion. You will follow my own journey into uncovering this history. And this is a large history. The Armenian genocide is the first instance of a nation state using its bureaucracy, military, parliament, nationalist, racist ideology, and formalized, organized killing squads to eliminate a minority group in a concentrated period of time. So the Armenian genocide plays an important role in the studying of modern genocide. We know that genocide has been practiced all over the world since the beginning of recorded history, and we know it's being practiced on the planet right now in a number of places. But the Armenian event has a particularly important place in the history of that tragic anatomy of mass killing. And I tell a bit of that story in the second part of Black Dog of Fate, how I came to uncover this history by navigating and excavating various texts from U.S. Ambassador Henry Morgenthal's own memoir. He was the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey during those years, to U.S. consuls stationed in the killing fields of Turkey where the Armenians were being wiped out. The very last part of the book deals with the issue of denial and the Turkish government's continued denialism of the Armenian genocide and its worldwide effort to rewrite the history, to sanitize the history, to cover it up. I'm happy to say that Turkish government's efforts are not working in this day and age, but the efforts are still there. The knowledge about this history has become broad and well received, at least I know in Europe and North America, South America. I don't know about South Asia or Central Asia, but I hope the history is percolating into a more mainstream way. You'll tell me. And the last part of my book deals with the ethical issue of denial. And scholars of genocide like to underscore the following, that the denial of genocide is the final stage of genocide. The final stage of genocide because it seeks to demonize the victims and rehabilitate the perpetrators. And it sends the message that acts of genocide don't matter and don't demand any moral accountability. And so that the memory part matters. Memory is a moral function. And perhaps Adolf Hitler's famous statement that he made 8 days before invading Poland in 1939 reminds us of that. What Hitler said in August of 1939 to his military advisors was, "Who today, after all, speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Armenian genocide had been front page headlines in the 19-teens and into the 1920s. By the late 1930s, it had been washed down the memory hole. Hitler was emboldened by that absence of memory. So I close this book thinking about the importance of memory and its ethical significance. So I will stop here at my part of the talk, and then I think we are going to do some readings between Chitra and I are going to do some readings between English and Tamil, and that to me is a great honor to be in your language and to hear some my passages in Tamil. And then I hope we can have some conversation. You know, that's important to me, and I'll stay here as long as you want me to. So I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from a chapter called The Woman in Blue, which will introduce you to the hero of this story, my grandmother, the survivor, the bearer of witness, who never lived to see her own story absorbed. So this is very early on in the book. When I was with my grandmother, I had access to some other world, some evocative place of dark and light, some kind of energy that ran like an invisible force from this old country called Armenia to my world in New Jersey. It was something ancient, something connected to earth and words and blood and sky. Now I realize that my grandmother's stories hibernated in me until I was ready to understand them fully. Or maybe marinated is a better word, since we are a people so steeped in food. Yes, marinated. Or is it cured, like grape leaves in brine, or lamb cooked in apricots, walnuts, and pomegranate juice, and left to soften and harden fat in an earthenware jug? Or long slabs of filet mignon packed in garlic and cumin and left to hang in the dark air of a basement.
நீல நிற உடை அணிந்த பெண் நான் என் பாட்டியுடன் இருந்தபோது வேறு ஒரு உலகத்திற்கு அணுக்கம் இருந்தது எனக்கு. வெளிச்சமும் இருளும் தூண்டும் இடம். ஒருவித சக்தி கண்ணுக்கு தெரியாத ஒரு விசை போல பண்டைய ஆர்மீனிய நாட்டில் இருந்து நியூ ஜெர்சி என்னும் என் உலகத்திற்குள் பாய்ந்தது. அது ஒரு புராதனமான நிலமும் வார்த்தைகளும் குருதியும் ஆகாயமும் சம்பந்தப்பட்டதாக இருந்தது. என் பாட்டியின் கதைகள் எனக்கு புரிதல் ஏற்படும் வரை எனக்குள் உறங்கிக் கொண்டிருந்தன என்று உணர்ந்தேன். ஒருவேளை காடியில் ஊறிக்கொண்டிருந்தன என்பது ஒரு சிறந்த வார்த்தையாகும். ஏனென்றால் நாங்கள் உணவு விஷயத்தில் ஊறிப்போனவர்கள் என்பதால். ஆமாம், காடியில் ஊறிக்கொண்டிருந்தன அல்லது உப்பு நீரில் ஊறிக்கொண்டிருந்தனவோ. உப்பு நீரில் ஊறும் திராட்சை இலைகள் போல, அல்லது ஏப்ரிகாட்டும் அக்ரூட்டும் மாதுளம்பழ சாறிலும் சமைத்த ஆட்டு இறைச்சி ஒரு மண்ஜாடியில் கடினமான கொழுப்பில் இலகவிட்டது, அல்லது இறைச்சியின் மிருதுவான பகுதிகளை அடுக்கி பூண்டும் சீரகமும் சேர்த்து கட்டி கீழ்தளத்தின் இருட்டின் காற்றில் தொங்கவிடப்பட்டது. என் பாட்டிக்கு அவரின் எல்லா கனவுகளையும் எங்கள் எல்லோரிடமும் சொல்ல விரும்பினார். ஆனால் என்னிடம் மட்டும் நாங்கள் தனிமையில் இருக்கும்போது அவர் தன் கதைகளை சொல்வார். ஒருவேளை அவர் அதே கதைகளை தன் மகள்களுக்கும் சொல்லி இருக்கக்கூடும். அவர்கள் சிறு பிராயத்தில் அவர்கள் ஒருவரும் அதை பற்றி ஒருபோதும் பேசாத போதும். என் பாட்டி சொன்ன கதைகள் காலத்தை ஒற்றி இருந்தது, காலத்தை ஒற்றி இல்லாமலும் இருந்தது. இடத்தை ஒற்றி இருந்தது, இடத்தை ஒற்றி இல்லாமலும் இருந்தது. அது மனதின் தேன்கூட்டில் சேர்த்து வைத்த பொருட்களின் ஒரு பகுதியாகும்.
You know, I was talking about the collision of cultures, the American and then that ancient Armenian that was embodied by my grandmother. So here, 3 paragraphs from another early chapter called Freedom, New Jersey. In the years after my grandmother's death, I came to discover that there were 2 kinds of memory. One was a personal web of sensations. That was suburbia, good times, romance, sex, friendship, and the body in motion. That kind of memory, that sense of limitless potential, was inseparable from the rock and roll that poured out of my large turquoise and gray Zenith transistor radio that my grandmother gave me when I was 8, or the smaller RCAs and Sonys I carried in my hand. Rock defined my sense of time because it embodied events in memory. Just a chord, a piece of melody, the pitch of a voice, the anticipation of a bar could trigger a moment past that was now present. The body was a labyrinth in which sound stayed like a disc forever spinning. And when the song returned on the radio or the phonograph, there was a flaring up in the senses, feeling jolting the mind, the past spilling into myth and nostalgia. The private storehouse of memory grew and then grew into itself. But I learned that there was another kind of memory, too. A kind of memory that was connected to something larger than my life. After my grandmother died, Armenia seemed more and more remote, and I lost my direct and visceral sense of the ancient Near Eastern world that she embodied. Yet, no matter how deeply I sank into the suburban life and the happy society of teenage Tenafly, my memory of my grandmother was a strange shadow appearing now and then to remind me that there was something else I needed to know. She imploded my present at the strangest moments without conscious provocation. She had become my pacht, the force of fate that called on me, whether I was ready or not, and who, like Lady Fate, was indifferent to my present moment, my station in life, or my need for security and comfort. She was history knocking on the door of the heart, and when she came knocking, her message often was opaque, symbolic, evocative. I was left to make of it what I could, but I could not escape the intrusion.
சுதந்திரம், நியூ ஜெர்சி. என் பாட்டி இறந்த பிறகு பல வருடங்கள் கழித்து நினைவுகளில் 2 வகை இருப்பதை நான் கண்டறிந்தேன். ஒன்று தனிப்பட்ட உணர்வுகளின் வலை, அது புறநகர், நல்ல தருணங்கள், காதல், காமம், நட்பு என்று செயல்படும் உடல். அதை போன்ற நினைவுகள், அளக்க முடியாத ஆற்றல் போன்ற ஒரு மனநிலை. எனக்கு 8 வயது இருந்தபோது என் பாட்டி எனக்கு கொடுத்த சாம்பல் நிற ஜினித் வானொலி பெட்டியும், பின்னாளில் நான் தூக்கி அலைந்த சிறிய RCAஸும் சோனிஸிலும் இருந்து வழிந்த ராக் அண்ட் ரோலில் இருந்து என்னை பிரிக்க முடியாதிருந்தது. ராக் இசை என் நினைவுகளின் நிகழ்வுகளாக திகழ்ந்ததால் என் காலத்தின் உணர்வுகளை வரையறுத்தது. ஒரே ஒரு இசை நான், மெல்லிசையின் ஒரு பகுதி, குரலின் ஒரு ஸ்ருதி, ஒரு இசை அளவீட்டின் எதிர்பார்ப்பை தூண்டிவிடும். கடந்த காலத்தின் ஒரு தருணம், இப்போதைய தருணமானது. சிக்கலான உடம்பில் உள்ளே தங்கிய சப்தமானது ஒரு வட்டுக்கள் போல எப்போதும் சுழன்றது. அந்த பாடல் வானொலி பெட்டியிலோ கிராமபோனிலோ மீண்டும் வரும்போது உணர்வுகளின் தீ பற்றி எரிந்தது. மனம் குலுங்கும் உணர்வுடன் கடந்த காலம் கதைகளிலும் நினைவுகளிலும் சிந்த, நினைவுகளின் அந்தரங்க களஞ்சிய சாலை பெருகி அதுவாகவே ஆகிப்போனது. மற்றொரு வகையான நினைவுகளும் உள்ளன என்று அறிந்தேன். அந்த நினைவு என் வாழ்க்கையை விட பெரிய விஷயங்களுடன் இணைந்தது. என் பாட்டி இறப்பிற்கு பிறகு ஆர்மீனியா மிகவும் தூரமாகிவிட்டது. என் பாட்டி உருவகமாக இருந்த பண்டைய அண்மை கிழக்கு உலகத்துடன் எனக்கு இருந்த நேரடி மற்றும் உணர்வுபூர்வமான தொடர்பு தொலைந்து போனது. இருந்த போதிலும் நான் எவ்வளவுதான் என்னை புறநகர் வாழ்க்கைக்குள், என் சந்தோஷமான சுமூகமான பதின்பருவ தெனாஃப்ளை வாழ்க்கைக்குள் மூழ்கினாலும், என் பாட்டியின் நினைவுகள் ஒரு விசித்திர நிழல் போல அவ்வப்போது நான் வேறு எதையோ தெரிந்து கொள்ள வேண்டும் என்று எனக்கு நினைவுபடுத்தி கொண்டே இருந்தது. எந்த ஒரு தூண்டுதலும் இல்லாமல் விசித்திரமான தருணங்களில் அவர் என் நிகழ்காலத்தை தகர்த்தார். அவர் என் பக்ட் ஆகிவிட்டார். என்னை அமைத்த விதியின் வீச்சு, நான் அதற்கு தயாராக இருந்தேனோ இல்லையோ, அவர் பெண் உருவில் வந்த விதி போல என் நிகழ்காலத்தை, வாழ்க்கையில் நான் இருந்த நிலையை, என் பாதுகாப்பையும் சுகத்தையும் பற்றி சட்டை செய்யாமல் இருந்தது. அவர் இதய கதவை தட்டிய சரித்திரம், அவர் தட்டிய போது அவர் சொன்ன செய்தி தெரிவில்லாமலும் குறியீடுகளாகவும் உணர்ச்சியை தூண்டுபவையாகவும் இருந்தது. எனக்கு புரிந்தவரை அறிந்து கொள்ள விடப்பட்டேன். ஆனால் அந்த குறியீடுகளில் இருந்து என்னால் தப்பிக்க இயலவில்லை.
Whatever my translator wants, I'm happy to do. But we'll read 2 more passages and then let's have conversation as you would like. I mentioned the whole business of cuisine and food being so important to the transmission of culture, history, culture, and everything. So I read a little passage here about that, about our family in the midst of the suburban street or block or neighborhood we were in. Food for us was a complex cultural emblem, an encoded script that embodied the long history and collective memory of our Near Eastern culture. I didn't know that eating was also a drama whose meaning was entwined in Armenia's bitter history. In 1960, I hadn't even heard the phrase starving Armenians, nor did I know that my ancestors were among the more than 2 million Armenians who, if they weren't killed outright, were marched into the deserts of Turkey in 1915 and left to starve as they picked the seeds out of feces or sucked the blood on their own clothes. In 1960, I was unaware of the morality play of the dinner table, but I was aware of how irritatingly intense my parents were becoming about the propriety and ritual of dining.
பாகம் 2, அத்தியாயம் கிராப்ட்ரி சாலையில் டைம். உணவு என்பது எங்களுக்கு ஒரு சிக்கலான கலாச்சார சின்னம். எங்கள் மத்திய கிழக்கு கலாச்சாரத்தின் கூட்டு நினைவகத்திலும் நீண்ட வரலாற்றின் குறிப்பிடப்பட்ட எழுத்து வடிவமாக திகழ்கிறது. உணவருந்துவது என்பது ஆர்மீனிய வரலாற்றுடன் பின்னப்பட்ட ஒரு நாடகத்தின் உள்ளர்த்தம் கொண்டது என்று எனக்கு தெரியாது. 1960இல் நான் பட்டினி கிடக்கும் ஆர்மீனியர்கள் என்ற சொற்றொடரை கேட்டது கூட இல்லை. என் முன்னோர்கள் முற்றிலும் கொல்லப்படாத 2 மில்லியன்களுக்கு மேற்பட்ட ஆர்மீனியர்களை சேர்ந்தவர்கள் என்றும், 1915இல் துருக்கி பாலைவனங்களில் அணிவகுத்தும், மலத்தில் இருக்கும் விதைகளை பொறுக்கியும், தங்கள் உடைகளில் இருக்கும் இரத்தத்தை உறிஞ்சியும் பட்டினி கிடக்க விடப்பட்ட 2 மில்லியன் ஆர்மீனியர்களை சேர்ந்தவர்கள் என்று எனக்கு தெரியாது. 1960இல் உணவு மேஜையின் ஒழுக்க நாடகம் எனக்கு தெரியாதது. ஆனால் என் பெற்றோர்கள் எரிச்சலூட்டும் அளவிற்கு தீவிரமாக உணவருந்துவதை வழக்கமாகவும் சடங்காகவும் ஆக்கிக் கொண்டிருந்தார்கள் என்று நான் அறிந்திருந்தேன்.
And I'm going to close with a passage about another extraordinary woman and survivor, my grandmother's dear friend Achabni, who went by Dovey, to translate that into English. Dovey's story is a story of the survival of brutal violence. There is violence in the second half of this book, as there inevitably must be if you're making a journey into the history of this genocide. So this is in the voice of Dovey. By the time we were marched into the desert, there were very few of us left. Almost everyone had died. Many had been thrown into the caves at the Euphrates and been set fire to. Dikran died there. But when we reached the desert, Takui, Hagop, and I were still together. On the second night in the desert, I lay on the hot ground to sleep. I never had trouble falling asleep. My dress was shredded and my cuts were festering. At night I dropped into numbness, thinking always that the next day we would arrive somewhere where someone would help us. Shortly after I dropped to sleep one night, I felt myself floating out on the air, and the ground was vibrating, shifting, and moving, as if a terrible hiatus had opened under me. I looked up, and the sky was clear and black, and the Milky Way was swirling like the muslin in the wind. I was on the back of a horse, the horse of a Kurdish nomad. I spent the next 5 years in the house of this Kurd. I bore him 2 children.
பாகம் 5 ரத்தம் தோய்ந்த செய்தி, டோபியின் கதை. பாலைவனத்தில் நாங்கள் அணிவகுத்து அனுப்பப்பட்ட போது மிக சிலரே மிச்சமிருந்தோம். பலரும் அதற்குள் இறந்து விட்டிருந்தனர். பலரும் யூப்ரிட்டிஸ் நதியின் அருகே குகைகளில் எரியப்பட்டு தீ வைக்கப்பட்டனர். திக்ரன் அங்கேயே இறந்து விட்டான். ஆனால் நாங்கள் பாலைவனத்தை அடையும் போது தகுய், ஹபோப் மற்றும் நான் பிரிந்து விடாமல் ஒன்றாகவே இருந்தோம். பாலைவனத்தில் 2வது இரவு. அந்த சூடான நிலத்தில் நான் படுத்திருந்தேன். எனக்கு எப்போதுமே தூக்கம் வருவதில் சிரமம் இல்லாமல் இருந்தது. என் ஆடை துண்டு துண்டாக கிழிந்தும் என் வெட்டு காயங்களில் சீழ்பிடித்தும் இருந்தது. அடுத்த நாள் நாங்கள் எங்கேயாவது போய் சேர்வோம் என்றும் அங்கே யாராவது எங்களுக்கு உதவுவார்கள் என்றும் எண்ணிக்கொண்டே இரவுகளில் நான் உணர்ச்சியற்று போவேன். ஓரிரவு நான் தூக்கத்தில் விழுந்த சற்று நேரத்தில் நான் காற்றில் மிதப்பது போலவும் நிலம் அதிர்ந்து இடம் மாறி நகர்ந்தது போலவும் உணர்ந்தேன். ஏதோ ஒரு கொடுமையான இடைவெளி எனக்கு கீழே திறந்து விட்டது போல இருந்தது. நான் நிமிர்ந்து பார்த்தபோது வானம் தெளிவாகவும் கருப்பாகவும் இருந்தது மற்றும் பால்வீதி காற்றிலாடும் மெல்லிய மஸ்லின் துணியைப் போல சுழன்றது. நான் ஒரு குதிரையின் மேலே சென்று கொண்டிருந்தேன். ஒரு குர்திஷ் என நாடோடியின் குதிரை. அடுத்த 5 வருடங்களை நான் அந்த குர்தின் வீட்டில் கழித்தேன். அவனுக்கு 2 குழந்தைகளை பெற்றெடுத்தேன்.
Thank you. Thank you. Chitra, thank you so much. It's a joy to hear you read my words in Tamil. Now, and both of us, or we'd love to have conversation, both about translation, if that's of interest, about anything else on your minds.
Yeah. Translating the fiction, the stories is very easy. But when it comes to poetry, translating a poetry is a difficult thing. And through poetry, we cannot get its original essence at some times during translation. How your poetries are being translated in many other languages. What is the secret behind it?
Well, I'm happy to give you one of my take on that, and maybe Chitra, you want to talk about this issue if you do. I can tell you that I can tell you what you know, as poetry, of course, is non-narrative, so that it's made of phrases and rhythms compressed rhythmic phrasing is at the core of the kinetics of the poem, right? So how do you get compressed rhythmic phrases from one language into another when the languages don't share the same syntactical electricity, the same syntactical synapses, okay? You get what I mean. So you have to come up with a version of it. It has to be a version. You can't try to be literal. You have to decide, that phrase, let's take this line from Theodore Roethke, an great American poet. In a dark time, the eye begins to see. In English, well, what are you going to do with that in Tamil? I have no idea because I don't speak Tamil, but you come up and Vivek, who's done a lot of translating. Vivek, you may want to talk about this now. Vivek has translated from Tamil into English and back and forth. What in the sound rhythm register gets opened up for you in the language? Or Chitra, both of you may want to comment on this.
No, actually, when it comes to translating poetry, EVP is more looked for. But when I took up this project, I thought it's not fiction. So I would not find the same challenge with the poet, the translator translates poetry, but actually it's not. Because he happens to be a poet. And I do find the nuances in the rhythm of the poetic kind. I find lyrics to take.
No, I just want to say, I love the rhythm of your translation much. And that's what you said, it's a thought version. But it's impossible, it's the impossibility that means possible.
Mm-hmm.
So when you write a book, always we go for imagination. So from the imagination only we create characters. But actually these characters are from your memories. Did you use your imagination to give a colorful picture of the characters? Even though it is a memory.
Yes. Well, it's an important question. That is, after all, I'm writing about my life. Let's say 1990. 30 years. I'm looking back 30 years, and I'm creating the characters in my family. Of course, they're as close to me as any people could be: mother, father, grandmother. The first three sections of my book are called mother, grandmother, mother, father. But yes, you have to put clothes on people. You can't remember everything precisely. There has to be some liberty. You can't make up untruths about events or conversations, but you will have to shade and color and enrich the portrait as a writer using with your imagination. So, I generally know that my father went to work every day in these very dark Brooks Brothers suits and white starched shirt with a red or blue tie. I know that, so I can be faithful to that. But how did the conversation play out at the table when we had an argument about a term paper I wrote about Turkey when I was supposed to write about Armenia? That's an interesting moment. I have to come up with the dialogue. I have to approximate the dialogue. I have to do some filling in of the blanks. So you have to do some of it.
Because you're giving a list of sufferings of your family, but you have imaginated. So it is your visualizing it was a direct
I can only depict my grandmother through my experience, of course. So the memories I have of her are my memories of her. I now, as an adult writer, am doing a little interpreting of the conversation or the event. There's what I call in writing memoir or creative nonfiction, the mediating voice and the mediating mind. In that we can't go back to be 8 years old again. We're now 45. So there's something between the 8-year-old and the grown-up writer that's a mediating reality. It's a part, I think it's a universal part of writing memoir. Because you're not, excuse me, you're not pretending to be 8 years old, but you're looking back at being 8 years old and you're creating that with a new sense of sophistication, perhaps. Yeah, I hear
Yeah,
you're fine, sure.
Thank you, Mr. Peter, right?
Thank you.
For covering your book in a very subtle manner, briefly. But you really kindled our curiosity to go in for more. That is where we need to read your book fully. I mean, that is what I want to thank you for. That is one part of it. Second is for some people who want to go in for the English version. Is the book available somewhere?
Yes, the book is available online, easy to buy. Just online. Go to Amazon or wherever you buy books. Go to, you'll see on the internet. This is just a fresh edition, brand new. I'm happy to say, the book's been in many translations, in German and Dutch and Greek, in Armenian, Spanish, but Tamil is really very exciting for me. I mean, to be in an ancient Dravidian language, to have some representation here in South India is very exciting. So I'm very grateful. I'm very honored. I'm very grateful to you. Russ, I'm very grateful to you and Sadagam Press. Really special.
The other one is about the genocide. I don't know if you are covered in your book about the reasons or the causes. Is that come up in the book?
Yes.
From your version?
Yes.
Or from the family side?
It comes up through eyewitness accounts from the period. I'm using historical texts in the last part of the book to chart my own education. You're following my education, my own coming to understand this history by reading. I mean, this is a challenge for a writer. You have to make your own ingesting and reading of other texts interesting in some way to a reader. Say, okay, there's some drama in reading. See what you think. I hope you find it interesting. So you will be introduced to various important works about the Armenian genocide in this book.
Can you mention a couple of points?
Well, one is Ambassador Henry Morgenthau's famous story. Ambassador Morgenthau's story was published in 1918 in the U.S. He was the U.S. ambassador to Turkey during this period, and he has 3 important chapters on the Armenian massacres, and they were the first of their kind in English to be read by a broad public. So Ambassador Morgenthau will be something you really will encounter. And you've been have you started translating that yet? Okay, she'll have an interesting experience with that. And then I use the U.S. consuls, the foreign service officers stationed in the killing fields areas and the dispatches they're writing back to the U.S. government and to Ambassador Morgenthau. So I'm reading those and my lights are going off in my head. So you have that. Those are really primary sources from the period. Now, today there are many, so there's all kinds of scholarship you can There's a bibliography at the back of the book, and we put it in. We could even expand the bibliography in the Tamil edition because there's so much interesting material on the Armenian genocide. So I hope the book becomes a jumping board, springboard into learning more about this important history.
There's one more thing to know is you and your family have gone through this trauma. What kind of peace have you made with this?
What kind of peace have my family made with this trauma is the question. Well, it's a universal question. How do all people and collective cultures come to terms with traumatic histories? I certainly don't think there's such a thing as closure. I think that's a fake idea. There's no real closure. You know, horrible events happen to people, and they have to figure out how to survive and how to evolve. And as my friend Robert Lifton, the research psychiatrist who's written so much about survivors, how survivors develop their own survivor missions in life, their own ethical commitments to human rights, perhaps social justice. These are trackable patterns in survivors. So I think it's about evolution into a more creative and productive ways of dealing with the trauma. I mean, those in my generation are lucky. We are just the receivers of this from 2 generations ago. So the reception for me as a writer, as the grandson of survivors, I'm protected. I receive the trauma emotionally, psychologically, and as a writer, I've had the good luck to be able to write about it. That's useful to me personally. So I think it's about creative evolution.
Thank you for that. All the best for your translation.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for the fine translation.
So the genocide is still happening. Genocide is
still happening.
As a writer, should we have to document the events, or the focal point of the writer should be a different one to come out with the truth or some moral lesson to the society to stop this? Because it has been happening. What should be the solution, or what should be the responsibility of the writer to reach the society?
Right. Huge question. And you may want to answer, Chitra, as well. What is the response of the writer today to crimes of genocide or similar crimes of mass violence around the globe? They're happening all over the place. They're happening in Gaza. They're happening in Sudan. They're happening in Myanmar, and many other places. Human rights crimes happening in Ukraine at the hands of Russia. How do writers deal with this? I have no simple answers. I do think that having community among people matters. I happen to be a member of a group in the US called Writers for Democratic Action. And that community to me is an important community. We try to do basic work that has to do with democracy. Look, democracy is not doing so great in our country right now. Don't get me started on it. I'm no fan of Mr. Trump, but we'll have to watch our nation struggle through the next few years and hope we come through intact. I think writers, if you're talking about writers or all humans, need to find community to resist what needs to be resisted, to witness and give voice to atrocities, because speaking out matters, voices matter, truthful reckonings matter. any case of genocide that you will study survivors and witnesses. You will study those who have given testimony. And that testimony is important for the present and for the future. Unfortunately, there's no simple answer about prevention. I mean, look, the human species is a violent species. And we need to figure out ways to avert mass violence as a solution to political problems. I want to believe that women may have more of the answers to this than men, because men haven't done such a good job averting mass violence. Too much mass violence as a solution to problems is not helping the planet. So it's an ongoing struggle, but the key is stay in the struggle. Can't drop out. We have to be part of the struggle as we're part of a global species. And more as we struggle with climate change and global phenomena, we need to see ourselves as a species together struggling for progress.
One thing I would like to add, we all belong to the same genetic pool called human beings. So I think it's more than in a cultural setup or the milieu that we live in, or in a political structure or societal cultural structure that we live in. We might not be exposed to all kinds of world experiences. And that is possible only by interactions with other languages, world languages, and the huge body of literature that comes along with that language. Translation helps in that kind of an interaction, where we get to see the experiences, good and bad ones, different set in different cultural milieu. That will give us an understanding and a worldview, especially in a scenario, in the situation or the generation that we live in. I think for that reason, we have to read translated works are necessary. And there will be a kind of a stunted growth to any language or any literature if there is no interaction with other languages or other literatures written in other languages. In the current scenario, memory studies, especially from an academic point of view, starting with the Holocaust, you find that memory studies are gaining momentum, especially in the city as of now. There might be some academicians or research scholars here. Memory studies is gaining momentum in the city right now. It is in the trend in the research arena. And memoirs also come under that. When we read these experiences, we will be able to empathize with the victims, and that will give a better sensibility to the reader, and by creating an awareness of that sort through books and translations, which will actually help in the bigger picture. And I have a question.
Very important what you're saying about translation as a interlocking force between cultures. Really important, very important. That's why we need to keep literature central and the book central. It matters more than ever in the digital age where literature and the book face so much noise. We need to keep that. That's why I'm also very excited to be here at the Chennai Book Festival. I'm going to go tomorrow night because that keeps the book as the foundation of consciousness and knowledge. Yes.
One more question from an academic point of view. Food trope in literature. I found that very interesting in your book when I was reading the first two parts of your book, your grandmother and the mother's part. Food trope in literature, food as a cultural emblem or food as a narrative tool that you have used, and the stories of your grandmother. Through stories and food as a cultural emblem. And it might be an interesting point or take for researchers and research scholars and students and academicians. Do you have anything to add to that?
So you're asking me about the importance of food as a culture,
trope in literature,
as a trope for culture, and as a whole language of history, as well as joy and sensual pleasure and nourishment. We won't forget that. But what were you asking me about students too?
Food trope in literature.
The food trope in literature. Yeah, that's a whole course. That's a seminar we could teach on food. You know, it's a great course, isn't it? And I think these courses are happening in the curriculum, that people are teaching courses on food as a trope for culture, or food and literature. Yeah, these in the U.S. these are in the curriculum. I don't know if they are here in your curriculums. Are they?
There are research scholars who take up projects of that sort.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's powerful, important, and also pleasurable and fun to study. I'm looking forward to experiencing many cuisines in my trips, in my, not only here in Tamil Nadu, but also as we head to Mumbai, head to Varanasi, head to Calcutta. We're going to get all kinds of cuisines. Am I right? We'll get different cuisines everywhere. Indian food has a huge, we call it Indian with a big, it's like a big rubric, but it has a huge presence in the US. In my college town, there's one Indian restaurant, a small, beautiful, I teach on a beautiful college campus in the rural part of New York. I'm north of the city, Colgate University. It's an old, gorgeous institution. Vivek knows it well because he was there. We have an Indian restaurant, it's Punjabi, but the place is packed. The students are in that restaurant is the most popular restaurant in town. So Indian, whatever kinds of Indian foods they are in the U.S., they're packed. It's a very popular part of the American experience of your culture here.
One more question. As a memoirist, when you present facts to the readers, how do you do that without losing out on the aesthetic sensibilities, transferring the aesthetic sensibilities? How do you do that?
When I'm conveying facts.
Being a poet or a novelist is different from a memoir. Is it different? How do you, when you pass on facts and experiences of other people, or from eyewitnesses or other sources, whatever knowledge that you've gained, and when you're passing it on as when you're translating it into a memoir, how do you do that? How much of your imagination and how much of the creative side in you interfere with the facts?
Yeah, what's the relationship between the creative imagination and the sculpting, right? The building up of facts, of historical facts. It's a great question and one that we could be here for a whole afternoon.
Do you think poets do it differently?
Okay, so two questions. I'll come back to yours, Vivek. I think you have to keep the fact honest, accurate as possible. But what's going to make the difference in the work, the literary work you're writing, is how well you transform the fact into an interesting story, trope, scene, image. That the whole thing is about imagination. So you have to take the historical and do something significant with it, both imaginatively and linguistically. So everything in the end for the writer comes down to language. How do you make your syntax? How do you create your phrase? Now, for Vivek, coming to your question, for me as a poet, I do think poets write memoir differently than fiction writers and journalists. I think, I will speak for myself, more driven by the image, more driven by phrase, more driven by rhythm and the sound and the cadence of phrases, pulsations, and sentences are different for me. I can see that one. You make your decision about what you like better, but I can see the journalist doesn't write with the same sense of ear for the most part. Whereas as poets, we're trained by ear, image, phrase, rhythm, cadence. So I hope you will find in my memoir that music happening within the language. I hope you will. I hope you will, because that's what drives it. I'm more interested in freezing a scene, freezing it, and lingering in it. I don't want to move fast. I want to go in. You know. So that's poet time. As you know, Vivek is a poet. Poet time is different. So maybe we're at a good place. Is this a good place to call it? And if there are other questions, I'm happy to take them, but you guys have been a great audience. And tell me, we're good? Oh,
I want to
oh yeah.
really we want to know, we want to show our identity. I'm an American, I'm Armenian. We want to have really want to have the identity. That leads to the racism, I think. Want to know if I am a Jew. Every people saying their own identity. No, people are I'm a Jew. I'm an American. They are saying really we want to know say that identity. Because of that identity, the racism comes.
So the question is, how do our identities play out in the larger state we belong to, the larger country, like in the US? Do you mean in the US, for example? I mean, the interesting thing about the United States, I don't know how many of you have spent any time in the US, and you would tell me how the parallel is in India because you're a nation of vast number of ethnic groups and you're a large nation in land mass and in population. US, smaller in population, but still 50 million people and a sizable landmass. And we, we have prided ourselves on being a nation of multi-cultures, a multicultural nation in which many ethnic groups have managed, managed to have managed to find common ground and be Americans. There has been an idea in American culture, in USA culture, of the melting pot, in which you come from different ethnic groups from different parts of the world, and you melt a little bit into a common culture. Now that's been challenged a lot in the last 25, 30, 35 years. And there are more tensions between some ethnic identities and the melting pot mainstream. And the segments of white America that are not progressive, the backward parts of white America. We use the word rednecks. Okay, I hate to talk about the U.S. in pejorative terms, but you know we have our backwards components and we have our progressive components. This conversation could lead me into a long political discussion because Mr. Trump is not somebody who's been very favorably inclined to multiculturalism. He wants to expel immigrants from the country, and a lot of us find this horrible, abhorrent. You can tell I'm not a fan of this whole movement. So I think at its best, the U.S. Has achieved a marvelous multicultural fabric. Jews, Armenians, Irish, Germans, Italians, Russians, Indians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. I mean, really amazing. And then there are the places where the tensions can start to happen too. We also have a long, complicated history of the enslavement of African Americans and the genocidal eradication of Native Americans. So these are America's two original sins, slavery and Native American genocide. So we have to deal with that as well. That may get us into another complicated place. So your question, again, is like part of a whole 3-day seminar that we could have here. But thank you for it. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming out today. And I hope my book will reach you in Tamil in May or June when it appears. And again, I'm very grateful to Chitra's translating and to, of course, Tadagam Press's publishing the book. Very grateful. Thank you.
It's been a wonderful experience and it's an honor to share the stage with you. Thank you so much. And I take this opportunity to thank Mr. Ramudarasan of Tadagam Publication for giving me this project and the audience for sparing their time to grace location. Thank you.
Now, our Chief Librarian, Mr. Dr. Sadhana Kathiyan, Chief Librarian of Anna Central Library, will honor the guest.
Gorgeous, beautiful.
Vote of thanks. On behalf of School Education Department, Directorate of Public Libraries and Anna Central Library, I thank Mr. Peter Vilakian for his wonderful speech and message. I also thank our in charge, Mr. Karthikeyan sir, for initiating such programs to enrich our knowledge in different subject areas. I also thank our library staffs and users. Thank you, everyone.